Good morning. I think I'm out of coffee. Believe it or not, this is my third video, but I'm going to try and keep it short and get them on this morning. Down to about 30% on power on here. What I want to talk about today, because I've covered hydraulics and electrical, which is pretty much the rest of a machine. I didn't do much on transmissions or power shift yet. That'll probably come later. It talks of the experiences I've had with this stuff and give you a rudimentary idea how some things operate. Most of modern equipment with engines anymore, believe it or not, some engines have gotten away, come into sorts and gone out of sorts. Let me describe some of the basic things that have come into. Now, some of you hear about common rail and high pressure common rail systems and serious pressure and all of the stuff in the fuel system in your engine. The combustion chambers have changed, but not that much, because almost all of it's in the piston and some of it's in the porting. Some of you may go back long enough that remember that Leyland and some other companies had a masked valve, and the idea was to have it right in the way of the air. It was a little tab, your valve head, and a little bitty tab underneath it, and the air would come in, hit the tab, and it'd diffuse it. Well, it actually restricted the airflow getting in there, but still, it was something that they put in there to try and help. The modern day, they may do something in the valve, but valves rotate, so it's kind of a pointless thing. Those valves didn't rotate. Well, our idea of the fuel system of today isn't as changed as much as you might think. Let me get into it simply for you. The modern fuel system on almost everything that's diesel has been mandated, unfortunately, by the UN, European standards, and over here as well. The common rail pressure system is simpler than you think. Believe it or not, it's a modification of the old jerk pump systems of the past and a kind of a distributor pump like your old CAVs or Stanodyne Rosa Masters. There's not much difference going on here. In fact, in one case, Cummins took their cap system that had a distributor head and a high pressure pump all in one massive pump with a control valve. Same idea as in your main injection pumps. Same ideas, put it together. All of it in one. When it worked, it was fantastic. But it didn't work well enough. They didn't put enough research and development in. So what do we have in our basic systems? And almost all of them today with a common rail. Very few of the larger engines. The very large and the very small have the old style systems. But we'll get into your basic common rail systems that almost everything has in between. Some actually are still running a system similar to Detroit diesel. And Cummins have changed over to something similar to that. But the common rail starts with your fuel tank. Some of them have a fuel filter pickup, some don't. They have a transfer pump, some of them in the tank, some is outside the tank. So you move your vacuum side of the system to a pump and filter usually, to a low pressure side of the system going up to a high pressure pump. And the high pressure pump is similar to your old jerk pump. There's two pistons in there. Instead of controlling a rack, they have a computer controlling a flapper valve. It's that simple. It wants to pump, it shuts it so it can't. It shuts a valve so it can't go back to the tank. There's an actual drain back to the tank, just like the old pumps. It's just the valve shuts that return off. When you go to shut the machine up, there's no electrical power in most cases. Not all of them. There are a few that are different. But it just drops the valve open, and if there's no pressure builds, it stops. And it just pumps back to tank while it shuts down. It's that simple. So what's the valve do? The valve closes a return. It goes out. In most cases, one or two pistons. The line goes out to the fuel rail. And all the rail is a piece of steel with a hole in it. It hooks in or into the side and pumps into it. And it expands slightly. It actually acts like a high pressure accumulator because of what it is. There'll be ports in it for your injection lines going out and one or two ports for coming in. And to tell the computer what to do, there's a sensor, tells it what pressure that it's at. There's a computer under certain circumstances wants a pressure. And then on the end is a little valve in case something goes wrong, pops off. Now some of them actually have that valve as a control, but let's just stay with the simple. You got a pressure gauge and a relief valve. You've got your lines on a 4-cylinder, 4, 5, 6, whatever, coming off the rail. High pressure pump is just sized for whatever fuel that engine is going to run, how much it needs to run the horsepower. Feeds each injector, and each injector, believe it or not, the base of the injector is a poppet style injector, just as if it was 1945. Direct injection, so it'd be a little later than 45. But it's a direct injection style nozzle with a poppet valve in it and a spring with a set pressure, just like the old style injector, just as if you hooked up the line and took your hand pump and popped it to check the spray and the cracking pressure. Same style nozzle. You say, no, wait a minute, this is where it gets a little funky. So inside of that, it holds the pressure. Same pressure's in the rail. What controls it? Well, the valve's held shut because there's pressure on both sides of your little poppet valve. And there's some orifices in there they play with, how much comes in, how much goes out. And on top is a solenoid with a little pintle. As long as that little sucker's shut, then everything is balanced. That little valve stays closed. That little thing pops up just for a brief millisecond. What happens? Pressure drops on one side and the poppet opens up and sprays right into the cylinder, because the rail is always higher pressure than the little nozzle poppet. It's that simple. It's balanced. Just like anything else would be, if you put pressure on both sides of a hydraulic cylinder and both sides are the same, like a rod out each end, it's balanced, it goes nowhere. In fact, if the rod's poking out this side and there's pressure on both sides, it'll stay all the way down here all the time. And if the same oil pressure to both sides, you put a little orifice in between and you pop pressure off the other side, the rod's going to come back depending on how much time it has, isn't it? Because there's lower pressure, low enough that it comes right up. Same idea here. One side has, both sides have pressure on it. The tip at the bottom and the back side is bigger, so it holds shut. Drop the pressure on the back side, beak, it pops, because there's enough pressure to force it and to overcome the pressures, residual pressure behind it. And a little control valve up here, two-way valve they call it, open and close. It's just rattling along, running your engine. But the basic parts of the system are the same until you get to the electronics. The same operational. Oh, Bannon's War Room's running. So that's how a lot of them operate. EGR, what does EGR do? Well, they work best on turbocharged engines anyway. But the EGR is to take exhaust gas and run it into the intake. You say, why in the world? Well, the idea, believe it or not, is to dilute the oxygen. It's 78% nitrogen that comes in. And when they get through, you're under a load, out plowing in the field especially, but they run nitrogen into it more often than, EGR gas, they run into exhaust gas more than they would otherwise. Exhaust gas recirculation. What's the idea? Well, when you're under a load, you got heavy turbo pressure, and you're really building some heat inside that cylinder. It tries to take that sharp top temperature spike off by diluting the oxygen and nitrogen in there with the crap from the exhaust system. So it can't burn as hot. There's no possible way it can. And when they take that top pressure off, your nitrous oxide levels, and exactly in the combustion, all that nitrogen from our air that gets sucked in there and blown in there with a turbo, it takes that and kind of reduces it so it can't combine with leftover oxygen and cause nitrous oxides on the way out. See, nitrogen and oxygen are out here in the air separate. Inside the engine under heat and pressure, they can combine and make NO2 or NOx, NOx. And that's what they're trying to reduce. So EGR does that. Later on, well, we'll go with that. Keep going from EGR. They want to make it a little better. They want to get rid of particulates. Well, that's where they come in with a DPF. Some engines don't have a DPF, diesel particulate filter. It's actually a ceramic exhaust filter to catch all the particulates that they can. It's porous. They got channels in there. In between the channels are pores. So they try to keep it down so the stuff can't get through it, just the gases. They're hoping. Well, it plugs, of course. They got to do something with it. That's a regen cycle. Before the DPF is a catalytic converter similar to your car. Little honeycomb with rare metals on it to get hot. One of two things can happen here. They can inject fuel with a special injector, or in most engines, they'll have a third injection in when it goes into exhaust. They'll spray in a little fuel and it makes everything hot. Obviously, it's in exhaust, so it's not going to burn well. So it doesn't. It comes out, but there's fuel in there and there's heat. So when it goes through the catalytic converter, it gets even hotter. And when that stuff goes in and hits that ceramic filter, it burns out the soot that is captured in there. And they're hoping it falls out of the honeycomb into the bottom. It doesn't always do that, but they're trying to get it to burn off enough. Some of the stuff turns into a gas and goes out into the atmosphere. And they try to trap the ash inside. Hence the new oils. Low ash, low sulfur. The ceramic sulfur affects the metal in the catalytic converter, and the ash in the oils actually can get through and cause trouble in the exhaust because it always burns a little bit. Some of it's left and goes through, and the ash in the fuel as well can get in there and just monkey the thing up. So that's where a lot of the ash comes from, as well as your particulates that turn to ash when they're burned and cooked. They don't like to tell you that. It's not just the ash in the fuel. It's the ash from the leftover, obviously. So every so often it has to be cleaned out. 4,000 hours, 5,000, what they're looking at for a time frame. And depending on how much fuel you burn, how clean your engine is, did you have a bad injector today or two? Did the air filter get plugged and it didn't compensate? All that stuff changes when that DPF may or may not plug. But follow your regeneration cycles, it'll be okay. Well, that wasn't good enough for some people. So then they had to come up with the SCR. The Horse Whiz, your little blue fuel, your little blue cap that has water and urea in there. They spray that in after the DPF into the hot stream. Then it goes into a catalytic converter and supposedly knocks down some of the NOx. Why spray it into the hot stream? Because the urea and water turns into ammonia and water. Changes what's left of the nitrous oxides and nitrogen dioxides and such. Goes through the catalytic converter, changes them even further, goes out, and the ammonia is often too much. So they have to have another catalytic converter with more exotic metal substrate to try and capture all the ammonia they can and convert it before it goes out. Because I've smelled them without that extra catch converter that stinks, will burn your eyes when you only run it 30 seconds inside a shop. Why? Because a lot of those engines from Europe don't have the EGR valve I just talked about. They change the combustion chamber slightly, a little higher compression, change the turbo, a few changes there, how to control it with a computer, and then they spray urea. Instead of urea being sprayed into the final system only when it's needed under heavy load, they spray it continuously. So you'll have your exhaust system coming out, no more EGR. Some will still have an EGR, depending on how they need to control the engine. It'll come out, hit the catalytic converter, go through the catalytic converter, the supplemental Horse Whiz system. Some don't even have the catalytic converter. They seem to be able to get away without it, but 100% of them that I know of have had exhaust or turbo, the exhaust, catalytic converter, spray in the Horse Whiz, go through the SCR, reduce your NOx emissions, and then hit that trap, catalytic converter, for the ammonia. And they're able to do that, some with and without EGR. Most of them do have EGR, and that takes care of your supplemental catalyst reduction system, SCR. DPF, diesel particulate. And of course, there's the catalytic converter that they have fancy names for, but it's just a catalytic converter like your car. Same idea. So you can get fuel spray in here or fuel spray from injector. And then up top, you'll have your Horse Whiz injector on all things that have a supplemental catalyst reduction for NOx emissions. There you go. So you've got your fuel rail, you've got your EGR, you've got your DPF, catalyst and DPF system, and you've got your supplemental catalyst reduction NOx system in there. There's sensors and everything that go along with them. If you can, I highly recommend a diesel laptops or other type of system. You can get handheld units that are designed to work with over-the-road trucks, that work with some tractors on the market, especially more modern ones. Some of the older ones 20 years ago, 15 years ago, they don't work so well with at all. I've got a Nexic Blue Mini that works on some things, and some of them, all it'll give you is a code number. And then you can go research it yourself. But that thing was like $150 or $200 and hooks onto my phone anytime, anywhere. I don't need Wi-Fi for it. They connect together through Bluetooth. And you're sitting there, I don't want to fumble with all. If you got the tractor, it might be worth it. Because you might be able to go back in and actually read off codes for the serviceman. And that could help for his work. But anyway, I figured I'd cover the fuel systems. Their engine systems are basically the same internally. Your overhead valves. The only thing that changes in the fuel system really is it the electro-hydraulic or electro-fuel hydraulic injection nozzle of the common rail system, or is it the old Cummins and Detroit style that are still use a cam? Now, they talk about high pressures, and one of the things I'll tell you years past, even with Alice Chalmers International, any of them, they raise their fuel injection pressures so that they have a finer spray coming out, reduce the smoke. And Alice had them up in a 4,000 pound range at 4,500 pounds, popping pressure. What that meant was under full throttle, but specifically full load conditions, it was 8,000 psi that were coming out of that nozzle because the poppet was back out of the way and they were trying to jam fuel in there as much as they could. 8,000 to 9,000 psi has already been available in most of these engines. In some cases, it's triple that. It was up in the 10,000 to 12,000 psi injection range while the engine was running, under full load, on a dyno or plowing or chopping or whatever. So when people say, oh, we've seen pressures like this we've never seen before. No, we've seen these pressures before. The 10s, the 12s, the 15,000, they have been there. One guy said that they did a check on Cummins with their why they were having camshaft troubles years past, the small cams and even some of the earlier big cams, big cam 4 was the final result, I think, before they went into the N series, N14s and such, NTCs. The smaller cams they were having trouble with us. They went up in horsepower and they started doing a study and found out that while they were pumping more fuel through the injector into the engine, they had to change the size of the nozzle because they found out that there were some engines out there that there's no way to put a pressure gauge in it. So they did the mechanical thing. How much force did it take to pop that fuel out of there for how long? And they were coming up with injection pressures while the cams are failing, 60 to 80,000 psi. You heard me correctly, not 6 to 8, 60,000 psi was going out of those nozzles. And Cummins like to use 8 holes, small holes. So that's why some of the bigger engines that are out there, the Detroits and the Cummins and, what was the other, Cat, even some of the Cats, but Cat tend to run dirtier anyway. But the Caterpillar had some of the cam fired there. And you're talking 30,000 plus is a normal figure even in the past. So when they talk, common rail, 20,000, please. They say, well, Cummins was contained. That's right. It was a safer system to work with. Now you have a stored rail with injection lines and a pump, and from the pump up to the injector can have 30,000 psi stored in there when you're running under full load. Available at any time to pop. So you say, well, that's dangerous. When I shut it off, what do I do? Nothing. So what do you mean, nothing? Nothing. The system's designed to bleed down. You shut it off, just wait a few minutes, it's done. Everything bleeds off. How did they do it? Well, it bleeds off through the pump because the pump opened up and everything goes right on back. As soon as the pump shuts off, it goes back to tank. There are check valves in the system to hold it, but there's some bleed down in there, and it generally is just going to leak off. Simple as that. So, and if you're concerned, then you put a wrench on one of the fittings and you put a heavy-duty piece of rag, cardboard, and a block of wood over it, or even a piece of steel, and crack one of the lines and let it bleed off. Why do I say? Because cardboard's not going to hold that kind of pressure. And you want to hold it on there with a hammer, not your hand. Leather glove ain't going to protect you much. Well, it'll slow it down, but no, it's not a problem unless the system's actually working. And if you go to crack an injection nozzle while it's cranking, all you've made is a mess. None of the other cylinders can fire. They have snubber valves in there when the line comes out, and it's a line blow. It's still going to puke fuel, but it goes up, snubs it, and shuts it off, so it'll only leak down a little bit, and it doesn't spew fuel all over the engine, stall and leave you out in the middle of nowhere like some common rails used to. Used to be a broken injection line, you're down on the side of the road, done. It's over. Then you have to put a cap on it and drive home. Well, the snubber valve will allow you to run it. Well, if it's running and you limp it back, it may not restart. That's right. It snubs it when it's running. You shut it off, well, it's supposed to open up to allow fuel through. So that's something else to keep in mind on your fuel systems. Most of the fuel systems are, some are actually gear pumps because they're not raising that high a pressure, or low rotor pumps. Your low pressure systems are almost always low rotor pumps. Some are like an internal gear, the old-fashioned automatic transmissions, just to pressurize the high pressure side of the pump to get fuel to it. So that's like the old CAVs and Rosa Master were always round on the end. That was a vane type transfer pump. Well, these things have similar idea as well to transfer it. Cummins had an electric pump on some of them to develop pressure before you even turn the key, so it would high pressure pump like your Bosch VP44 or the Cummins modified cap system would get fuel pressure to them. Anyway, there's always a fuel pickup that can plug. There's always an inlet on the filter head and the filter that can get plugged. Some of them actually have internal screens in their fittings that you have to check. Pump failures, filter failures can go through. Any of that can cause a problem. Cracked injection line is going to be a problem. Another one to warn you about is if an injection nozzle is open, it may not restart. And if it does, it'll knock like a bandit. Might even crack piston rings or crack a piston. They will make a noise. Why? It's full fueling all the time, all the way around, all two revolutions to get your 4 strokes in. So may or may not even start. I had one when it started, it knocked and hammered, but at least once it started, I knew which injector it was. That's the hard part, is troubleshooting this stuff when there's a failure. The injector popped open and sprayed in there. Great, which one? In some cases, you have to pull the injectors and look in the hole to find out. They'll say, crank it. Well, I tried that, cranked it, and your little fuel will come out from each injector on the return side. A little pop-up valve opens, fuel comes out. How much? Well, that dead cylinder is supposed to have a lot come out of there. It's not that much, and you don't have enough battery to crank it. So your technician can have an awful lot of trouble with these simple systems, but they can have a lot of trouble with them trying to troubleshoot where the final thing is. But it still comes down to all of it. Restriction, restriction, restriction. Worn out pump that can't move enough pressure because it's high pressure. They don't put out the high volume they used to. They depend on a lot of air. They'll have pistons in here or a super high pressure gear or low rotor pump. But almost all of them are pistons. Actually, they are all pistons. The one that the actual low rotor runs anywhere between 1 and 3 pistons. Similar to a sprayer pump. No kidding. But anyway, your pump can be weak and not put out what it needs. The little flapper valves, the shuttle valves that are in there. And the other problem is, in the common rail, you could have your pressure relief valve leaking off. Your injectors could be popped open and taking too much fuel, or worn out and taking too much fuel. So your technician has to go through all of those to find out. You'll be checking how much comes out the return line. You'll be checking pressure in the return line, making sure the pressure in the common rail is reading appropriately. There's a lot of stuff in that one system for the tech that they can go through. Same in the DPF system. You know, what's going on with that? How did the fuel get into the system? If there's a DPF problem, what is it? You know, most common problems of the DPF system is what they call face plugging. What does that mean? It means that when things are running too cold and too cold of weather, and you idle too long, and in some cases it's not even that cold of weather, but the fuel won't completely burn going through the engine, and it comes out, the engine detects it. And they're worried about the catalytic converter, the very first one, when it comes out of the turbo, hitting in that big housing. That can actually have some face plugging from the soot, from semi-burnt fuel coming out, and there won't be enough heat for the catalytic converter to do the first stage burn-off and to knock down the nitrous oxides both. It's important. It won't develop enough heat to keep things going through your particulate filter. So that's one of the more common ones with that. The other is people hit the button and cancel the regen. And they don't do a parked regeneration enough. And when the question comes up, they don't call the technician to come out, connect his computer, and do a computer service forced regen. Those are the main problems there. The SCR systems, it's almost always the pump and the urea and something in their plugging. Almost every time. That and bad sensors. They have an ammonia sensor and 2 NOx sensors on almost all systems. NOx coming in, NOx going out, and then at the end, sometimes the NOx and the ammonia sensor will be on the end on the way out, both side by side. And sometimes they're in between, so they know separately what they're doing. But they're counting on that last ammonia trap to actually do a little more NOx work. So that gives you an idea that, yes, the systems are actually simple. If you tore that apart and laid it out, there's a lot of stuff. It'll blow your mind. But it's simple. The problem is on the troubleshooting end, what is the actual problem? And like I say, the SCR, to go backwards, the SCR system, your sensors and the pump system, they're noted for plugging up if they sit too long. If somebody tries to dilute the fluid, then the computer throws codes and it doesn't operate properly. Won't even spray into the system, then it clogs up the nozzles, it clogs up the pumps, then messes with the catalytic converters and plugs them as well. The backside on DPF is a regeneration problem. You don't do it often enough, you don't work it hard enough, that'll cause a problem there. Fuel systems, that's pretty standard. Keep clean, good fuel in there, don't get water in them. Because in your primary filter, in the bottom, this is the last thing, will be what they call a whiff sensor. Water, water and fuel. Who knew, right? And be careful what you're putting in there from your jugs and cans and everything else. A little bit of isopropyl only dry gas going in there for an additive, or continuously add fuel additive to help the system as it goes, and only use the cold weather stuff, the D-gel, when it's necessary. Because too much of that actually ruins the lubricity of the fuel. If you have too much, just a shot here and there, it's never going to cause a problem. But if you're doing it continuously, that can catch up with your fuel system. Unless you're in such a cold environment that it had been recommended to you to run it continuously. So treated fuel, that can be a good thing in this case, especially if you're running the stuff with 5 or 10% biofuel in it. Then find out what additive will help the biofuel. Get it in there. Biofuel can plug pickup screens, it can plug incoming valves, it can plug screens and the valves of the primary filter, it can plug the primary filter. It can get through the primary filter occasionally and plug the secondary filter too. And if you can get past all of that and your biofuel is still doing good for you, rock on. My cousin Matt had experimented and found out that sunflower oil works almost identical to diesel fuel. And he said he had less fuel system trouble, less plugging trouble, and actually increased his fuel economy. And sometimes it actually seemed like and the power was the same. So, just a thought. Might have even put out more power I'm just going by what I remember. So some biofuels might be good, but if you're running that recycled fry oil, you put your additive in there every tank full. When you put it in the big tank, and some's going to settle out, so make sure you shake it a little bit or keep it stirred up or have a way to stir it, and then make sure you got some in the tank in the tractor. Ugh. It's okay, but it's like ethanol in cars. If it's in the wrong car, ugh, never put it in your chainsaw. Well, there you go. There's your fuel system for today. And we're just about to hit 30 minutes. Fuel systems. A fast run through fuel systems. Catch you later.